Welcome to The Impact Effect, hosted by conscious leadership expert Tom Eddington, advisor to some of the world's most successful companies and CEOs, where each week we help executives, entrepreneurs, and organizers become more effective leaders while growing businesses that are making an impact in the world. And now, here's Tom.
Hi, I'm Tom Eddington. Welcome to the Impact Effect Network, a place where we have discussions about making business matter through conscious leadership.
My guest today is Rich Fernandez, leader of Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. Great to have you on the show today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Appreciate it.
I'd like to start our conversation by just having you share a bit for our audience about your background and the work that you're doing, both at SIYLI, but also the path you've taken to get there.
Sure thing. So I lead a educational nonprofit called Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, which is abbreviated as SIYLI, SIYLI.org, and that's intentional. It actually started at Google because I used to work at Google. I was the head of executive education there, and we were interested in developing a curriculum for the employees internally that focused on mindfulness and emotional intelligence. And eventually we spun that curriculum off as this separate nonprofit that I operate today. And we're global. We operate in about 50 countries, offering mindfulness and emotional intelligence tools to communities and organizations around the world. But my background is that of a psychologist. So I was trained as a psychologist, but I've always specialized in organizational and leadership development in mid to large-sized organizations. Spent about 10 years in the financial services at JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America in that function. And then later went over to eBay and headed the learning function, what's called learning and development function. And then later over at Google as part of the people development group there, and again, heading executive education. So I'm thrilled to be here today. Mindfulness, consciousness, emotional intelligence, these are all kind of areas that I've focused on for the last 30 years of my career.
So let's start. I know you completed your PhD studies at Columbia University. What led you into leadership development in particular? And then I'd like to learn a bit more about where the mindfulness fits in your life personally and professionally.
Yeah, absolutely. So since I was a kid, really, I was interested in basically human nature. And as you could probably see behind me, this bookshelf has a lot of kind of books and novels and writings on kind of basically the human condition. It was something that's always been fascinating to me throughout school as well. I was always super strong in the humanities and history and things like this. When eventually, after college, I got to travel around the world a bit for a year, wound up going to India and Thailand, learning a little bit about meditation there, spent some time in some monasteries and different places. And I think when it was time for me to sort of choose my professional life, I decided I wanted to really go deep in this kind of study, the professional study of human development. And so I went into psychology, and it was interesting going into psychology because, as some of the listeners may know, there's a few different branches of psychology. And at first I had thought that psychologists work primarily doing therapies or working in clinical settings. But what I came to discover was that there's a whole other area of psychology that doesn't work as much on the clinical and remediation aspect of human development, but actually works on the potentiation side of human development. In other words, helping kind of bring people to their full potential. And this was the whole field of organizational psychology and counseling psychology, which focuses on the science of health or hygiology rather than pathology, which was kind of more the clinical field. So I very soon then decided to go into that kind of branching and focus on organizational psychology and how people work together within organizations and bring these qualities of, bringing their best potential forward as people and as leaders within organizations. So that's where I focused my graduate studies. And then, like I said, eventually specialized in that once I got out there into the workforce.
What was it about leadership and leadership development in particular that became an area of focus for you?
Well, for me, I mean, it really starts with how we understand what a leader is. So for me, in the simplest equation, is a leader is somebody who has influence. And the interesting thing about that is, for me, that means that certainly leadership can be based on roles and authority in those roles, but even more fundamentally, leadership is just somebody who has influence. So this could be a family member, a community member, and then, of course, people in organizations who are able to demonstrate influence. So, like I said earlier, I sort of also had this interest in human development and potentiation, in things like mindfulness, in consciousness, one might say, and the idea of bringing together uh, these qualities of mindfulness, consciousness, with working with leaders who are people that have influence in their communities or organizations was fascinating to me, because it suggested to me, as I really kind of dove in there, that in working with leaders, it would be possible to support them in influencing organizations to positive outcomes. Because that was the other thing that has been an abiding interest for me, which is kind of the ethical development of people in general and leaders in particular. So, how do leaders act in the service and benefit of certainly not only their organizations, but broader society? And my sense was that as we develop people, we can develop leaders who could demonstrate conscious and ethical leadership.
So how do
If I
you
was honest, that's kind of the fundamental interest that I had in developing ethical and conscious leaders.
how do you make the distinction between, well, it's not really a distinction, but the nuance really between power and influence, particularly organizational power, and where does influence fit in, and how do you help with, from a leadership development perspective, how do you help the, leaders make that distinction and work with both power and influence?
Yeah, great questions, huge questions. You know, for me, I mean, these are really big questions. So generally, though, organizations' roles and then people within those roles are authorized by others with power. They're kind of allocated that power, given a specific role within an organization, and their job is to demonstrate leadership within that role. Just because you have a role doesn't mean you're an effective leader. It means that you have a role that has been assigned a certain amount of positional power or organizational power, that has been assigned a certain license to work with levers within the organization or society. In other words, laws or regulations, or to take certain decisions. But then it's the person in the role who has to inhabit that role and has to demonstrate leadership, which again is the ability to influence, and then influence towards a positive outcome, which is beneficial, ideally for all, because it is also possible to have power, demonstrate leadership and influence, but do so in a way that has negative effects towards others, perhaps beyond your in group, beyond the people in your organization or your society. And we have plenty of examples of people who had lots of power, demonstrated, one could argue, strong leadership, if you think about some of the despots throughout history, but were they ultimately beneficial, broadly writ? And the answer is pretty uneven. So, so my interest again is working with leaders who do have, roles in which they have significant authority, how then they can demonstrate leadership by exerting a positive influence, again, that has this kind of more ethical outcome. Because activism and the idea that we can use leadership and power towards positive ends has always been also an abiding interest for me. And I think it is possible. It's entirely possible to do so.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Something I've observed, and certainly in the last decade or so, and it's been going on long before that, is that we've seen a fundamental shift around the world. in that historically kings or leaders of countries, queens, have been the essentially driving the agenda of the world, and we now see businesses are driving the agenda of the world, and many leaders, I think probably most leaders of organizations, aren't prepared for those roles and responsibilities of driving the world's agenda. They've been focused, particularly for publicly traded companies, on the bottom line, and the shareholder and shareholder interest. And so, I'd love
Yes.
to get your take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on about that. I think kings and queens and folks who run more, one would say, the governmental side throughout history until fairly recently were the ones that held the majority of power. They still hold significant power. I mean, that's, governments around the world are one of the most powerful institutions, but not quite to the extent they had previously, because it's kind of about resource ownership and allocation, isn't it? And exploitation, frankly. And I think previously nation states kind of held almost all of that authority. The rise of the corporation is fairly recent, only the past few hundred years. But in the contemporary world we live in, of course, corporations, businesses, the private sector certainly does own and control and allocate a vast majority of resources in this world, in conjunction with nations and nation states as well. So it's kind of one of the key institutions. To your point about leaders not being prepared, especially business leaders, I think there's truth in that. I think it's also changing. As we know, recently in the Business Roundtable, there had been a shift. So the Business Roundtable, as I'm sure many of our listeners may be aware, is kind of a gathering of some of the most influential CEOs to really talk about fundamental business issues, the state of business today. And these are very influential leaders, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, Walmart, and a number of other globally influential companies. And this last meeting was the first time they kind of redrafted their charter, because previously, to your point, Tom, it was focused on the fact that the purpose of business is to deliver shareholder value add. And this is the first year in history that they've pivoted and now have kind of stated that the purpose of business is to deliver stakeholder value add. So that's really different. That's not just about return on investment for your shareholders, but it's kind of a broader understanding of the purpose of business and all of the dependencies related to business, and delivering value not only for shareholders, but also in consideration of the environment, the societies and communities in which they do business, the planet, and so on, a supply chain, and so on and so forth. Now, it's the first year they declared that, and it's new, and it's very arguable as to whether, in fact, that is how businesses broadly writ are oriented, because I don't think that's the case today. But I think it's interesting that these influential leaders of influential companies have aligned around that, because I think there is this dawning realization that the ends don't always justify the means at all, and that shareholder value add is a rather short-sighted and limited way to understand the impact, but also the possibility that exists for business to be more of what has recently been called a social enterprise, one that again takes into account the larger calculus of stakeholder involvement and impact in which those entities operate.
Yeah, the perspective I have is that they've opened a Pandora's box, because they don't the systems, the metrics, the things that will enable them to lead the organization from a multi-stakeholder perspective aren't in place, and anyone who's run an organization understands the competing interest of the various stakeholders.
Yeah, exactly. But whether or not those metrics exist now, it's kind of being forced on the organizations, because there's dawning realization that it's necessary to operate outside of these functional silos and in this kind of more interdependent way. It's just kind of how we all have to now do business globally. And so, climate change can affect, the agricultural sector in, let's say, developing parts of the world where there's major supply chain, which then impacts everything down the line. So we really have to think about, or even look at the trade wars now going on between the US and China and the downstream impact of all of that, that stream of interdependencies and the migration of, let's say, some of the manufacturing from China to a place like Vietnam, where I just came back from. You're seeing these kind of shifts now in the ways we need to operate, and they will beg for those kind of metrics. Deloitte Human Capital Survey 2018, I believe it was, just last year, talks about this shift from functional siloed organizations to more what they call symphonic organizations. It's a funny word, but it's a word that has to do with kind of the individual parts playing all together. And I think you will see that in the increasing interdependencies and hopefully the metrics and the sensibilities about how we have to do business follows.
Yep. So let's shift the conversation a little bit and talk about the trend we're seeing in contemplative practice finding its way into the corporate setting, finding its way into the broader public here in the U.S. and other parts of the world. And I'd love to hear your take on where that's coming from. I mean, certainly the research that's been done around how the brain functions is a contributing factor, but it feels like even before Richie Davidson's work and some other researchers' work, we were already starting to see more interest in bringing contemplative practice into the workplace.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, and you're referring there, Tom, to Richie Davidson, who's one of the preeminent neuroscientists in the field of what's called contemplative neuroscience, which is really looking at the effects of contemplative practices such as different types of mindfulness and meditation practices on the brain, and the ability for it to affect the very structure and function of our brain. In other words, to create this capacity of our brains to be plastic, neuroplasticity, the ability of our brains to change depending on how we use it, what we do, what we think. And so the evidence has been mounting that when we do contemplative practice, we can in fact change the brain. The simpler way to describe it is perhaps rewire the brain so that different neural networks work more effectively in conjunction with each other. And also we can actually grow some of the gray matter in our brain in certain areas. And those areas have to do with contemplative practice in this particular body of work, which has to do with being able to change our ability to focus, pay attention, and develop perceptual awareness of our own experience, of the experience of other people, and of the environment. Maybe to put it in plain English, there's a whole branch of brain science now that focuses on our capacity to train our attention and train our awareness and the beneficial effects of that. And evidence is mounting that, in fact, what people have known for millennia, right? For thousands of years, people have been doing these contemplative practices, these kind of mindfulness practices, things like meditation. But now science is starting to really show that there are, in fact, very strong effects on our physiology and on our brain. Now, I think there's rising interest in this. It's no accident that scientific study has turned more towards these aspects of brain function and of contemplative neuroscience, because I think there has been renewed and rising interest in the contemplative practices, mindfulness, and so forth. And I think that's because, we rarely as a culture take time to kind of reflect and take time to develop these qualities of attention and awareness. In fact, much of our attention has been focused on doing things and achieving, and less on kind of connecting with our kind of state of being and the states of beings of others. The how we do things, in other words. We've been busy doing the what and chasing kind of the external markers of success, and less so involved in just kind of understanding how we're going about doing that. It was Thoreau hundreds of years ago that said, it's not enough to be busy, so are the ants. The question is, what are we busy about? And when we start to use contemplative practices, we can really start to consider that question very deeply for ourselves and for others. So it goes to questions of meaning and purpose, but it begins with an understanding, kind of a check in to our own selves, to our own lived experience in the current circumstances we find ourselves in the present moment, and then also connecting with the lived experience of others. So this is a rare quality, I think, because we live in this 24/7 hyper-connected, always-on world where we're pretty much in a state of almost constant distraction, and where our focus is mostly external. Couple that with the kind of history of kind of focus on, again, these external markers, materialism, etc. These and the result is we have a very well developed capacity for awareness. Um, it's there, but it hasn't been a focus. It hasn't been something we've developed intentionally en masse. And now you're seeing much more interest in that, which is kind of the collective growing of consciousness, of awareness, of mindfulness in our lives, in our work, and then in all aspects, all domains of life, really.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Who you are is how you lead. Conscious leadership is an intuitive, intentional process requiring an open heart, an open mind, and a committed desire to fully own how you show up in the world. If you're a CEO, a solopreneur, or a community leader, Tom Eddington's ebook helps you amplify your strengths, making you the best version of yourself. Download the ebook today and become a part of bringing conscious leadership to the planet.
I've been watching the growth of SIYLI, the number of organizations you're doing the work in, and the ever expanding teacher training that you're doing to have more capacity to deliver that work. Talk a bit about what you're seeing in the growth, whether it's by industry or the organizations you're doing the work in, and also, and more importantly, the impact that you're having.
What we're seeing is, again, we're referring to this nonprofit, which I run, Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, or SIYLI.org, which is, yes, it's pronounced SIYLI.org. There, like I said, SIY, Search Inside Yourself, is a curriculum that grew within Google. I was a part of the early development of that, and then it's a curriculum that focuses on mindfulness and emotional intelligence for leadership. And this was like hugely popular within Google. In fact, it was and still is the number one curriculum training program internally for employees. It became so popular internally, we were getting a lot of requests by other organizations to offer it. And so we spun it out of Google in 2012 as an independent nonprofit that exists to, again, offer the tools of mindfulness and emotional intelligence to leaders, communities, organizations around the world. We are seeing huge interest in our offering and in this curriculum. Currently, we'll have about 700 teachers by the end of this year in 50 different countries. And we work across multiple sectors. We have a very large presence in the business sector, of course, coming out of Google. We work still with a lot of technology companies, a lot of the household names, both here in California, based in San Francisco, so near Silicon Valley, but also globally, a lot of technology companies, and then many other industries as well, ranging from the financial services to healthcare to educational institutions. We have contracts with whole governments. We've recently trained the entire teaching corps, all 10,000 school teachers in the nation of Bhutan, on these tools. Who are interested in bringing those there. We're talking to other governments, for example. And we're largely doing it through our network of certified teachers who operate, like I said, in 50 countries. So there's been a real, it's just been kind of an ever increasing interest and demand for having practical and accessible tools to exercise mindfulness and emotional intelligence within the context of organizations and communities. And it's just been exciting to see the growth. We've been seeing also some really positive impacts. Of course, we've been collecting data all along, and on indices of well-being, of sustainable performance, of leadership qualities, like being able to communicate effectively, being able to collaborate effectively. We're seeing statistically significant shifts pre-post for the participants who engage in our offerings. And our offerings are a blend of experiential live training together with digital learning, and then some virtual learning as well via pods, and also via webinars. So you kind of blend. It's a blended learning solution that helps build and then sustain these tools of mindfulness and emotional intelligence.
So I'd like to shift the conversation a bit to conscious leadership. For me, and the work I do with the executives I coach and the leadership teams I work with, I help them understand and appreciate that to be an effective leader, one of the first things they have to do is go inward and become more self-aware. And the contemplative practice is one of the essential pieces to helping them get there. I'd love to hear your take on how do you define conscious leadership, how do you work with it, and where that fits into the work you're doing with the resources and the training you're doing.
Absolutely, yeah. We're completely aligned, Tom. That's how I would describe conscious leadership as well, and how to go about developing it, which is through contemplative practices and also exercising the skills. But maybe if I pull the lens all the way back and I think about what is consciousness, it's a huge question. But I'd like to give a very simple answer. It's awareness, right? It's awareness of the experience you're having as you're having it. And then that also extends to the experience of others as you are both having it with them and yourself. And then obviously awareness of the larger environment in which you're operating as well, the world in the biggest equation. But fundamentally, it's about awareness. And then when you talk about conscious leadership, combining awareness with leadership, combining awareness with this capacity for influence that we all have. That to me is what conscious leadership is. And it's important to bring the quality of awareness to leadership because, again, leaders have influence. And they can have very positive and beneficial effects, or they can have, negative and dilatory effects on their stakeholders. So it's imperative to develop conscious leadership, which, by the way, when I talk about consciousness and awareness and leadership, I fundamentally believe that if you're a conscious leader, you will have a positive and beneficial effect because you can't help but also consider, like I said, and be aware of the impact of your actions and decisions on others. So conscious leadership does have an ethical foundation to it that really understands, excuse me, the interdependence of everyone involved, of stakeholders, and in understanding the interdependence and interconnectedness of all things and of stakeholders, then the decisions and actions that are undertaken by definition would need to be ethical and beneficial, unless you have very nefarious and kind of ill-guided sense of leadership, in which case that's not very conscious, it's not very aware. Again, if you're aware of interdependence, you can't help but do what's right and what's good for all involved. Now, I really like what you said, Tom, about contemplative practice being the basis for developing this quality of conscious leadership, for developing these qualities of self-awareness and awareness of others and the environment. I do think that is true because we don't have that muscle. We're, like I said earlier, we typically aren't focused on awareness itself. Our own perceptions, our own lived experience, we're usually focused externally. So contemplative practice is a great way to kind of turn the lens inward and also intentionally turn the lens to reflect on our impact on others. And it really begins there. That is the journey to conscious leadership, begins with contemplative practice. and you have to practice, right? Like it actually has to be. It's like you can't be in shape and in condition to run a marathon if you don't run. And so similarly, you can't really develop awareness as effectively if you don't actually practice the skill of awareness. And there are specific ways to do that. And that's the foundation of conscious leadership.
I'm just reflecting on the some of your initial comments in this conversation around your your genuine desire to see ethical leadership and moral leadership. And just over the course of your career and the work you've been doing, we've seen a steady and growing shift towards that. It must be incredibly encouraging for you. I suspect you're pretty hopeful and optimistic about where business in particular is going.
Yes, I mean, I like to consider myself an optimist. I think the progress is much slower than I had hoped. Certainly in business we see some positive steps, but we continue to see kind of ends justifying the means type mentality, and also just unconscious business practices. And so together with the rise of more conscious business practices, if you look at the political landscape, for example, in the United States or perhaps even in Europe, you see the rise of certain leaders, and I'm not even going to get into specifics, but you just see the rise of certain leaders that embody certain qualities, perhaps of consciousness, and then the flip of that, right, which is like kind of in the next set of leaders that come in, perhaps one could argue more short-sighted view of things, maybe less conscious, but it's this kind of movement of like a few steps forward, a few steps back. On balance, I do agree with you that we're seeing the rise of more conscious leadership. Again, the business roundtable, being conscious and sort of understanding that it's about stakeholder value add, not shareholder value add. Yep. That's huge right there. Now they have to put their actions and decisions behind those words. And there's real, kind of business implications for all of that. But I think the signs, let's say at least, are hopeful. Because Tom, if you ask people, name some business leaders, perhaps some world leaders that you would say you admire, that embody these qualities of consciousness presently, you could probably find a few names. But yep. Equally as much, if not more, you could find others who maybe are unconscious. Now, I think like I said, it's a dynamic, shifting balance. But on the whole, I really do love what Dr. Martin Luther King said, which is the moral arc of history is long and it bends towards justice. Yes. And use the term justice. I like to also think about justice in terms of consciousness, because you have to be conscious, you have to have this moral and ethical stance in order to bring justice. So like Dr. King, I like to believe that in the arc of history, we are bending towards more conscious leadership by degrees, I would say in fits and starts, but we are seeing broad scale interest in these conscious leadership practices, such as mindfulness, such as conscious leadership, conscious embodiment, such as emotional intelligence. I run an organization, like I said, that operates in 50 countries, and like the demand for what we do has just been steadily increasing, and there's been more and more integration of these practices in all sorts of organizations, like I said, from the most influential technology companies to governments in the developing world. And so to me, it's a sign that conscious leadership is on the rise.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network, the world's first 24-hour on-demand business and leadership video and podcast network, bringing conscious leadership to a global audience.
Like you, I'm a student of organization development, and when I look at some of the indicators that I monitor, one is around leadership development, and what are some of the indicators of what's important around leadership development. And also we've been seeing in the last 4 or 5 years a lot of interest and recognition of the power and impact of organization culture and the ability to grow and shape and be intentional about organization culture, and just seeing the interplay of an interest in leadership and leadership development and organization culture. Those, for me, are very encouraging indicators.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Culture is changing. Organizational culture is changing. There is much more consideration of kind of human-centered, as well as environmentally centered, practices. I live here in San Francisco, and the airport recently banned disposable plastic water bottles. Thought that was quite a bold move. And so, yeah, I think you're seeing more culture in cultures, and then eventually in the business and organizational practices, integration of conscious elements of leadership. And so, again, I think maybe one thing I should say is that I do think we are seeing some change. I think we're in the early days, Tom. I think these concepts are new for a lot of us and a lot of businesses, frankly, and organizations. I think we're just at the beginning of this, and it'll play out over possibly decades before we fully are able to integrate conscious leadership into not only culture, but into, by extension, business practices. But I am hopeful. It's kind of an exciting time.
So to that point, what do you think is next, or what do you think is needed next?
Well, that's a really good question. I think, as I said, it is early days and we're just at the beginning, but I think leaders practicing these contemplative practices more, and onboarding for themselves what it means to develop awareness, to develop consciousness, to have a broader view of leadership and the purpose of our institutions, to encompass that sense of interdependence and interconnectedness, and then to act accordingly, rather than simply being short-sighted and just chasing the short-term impact. I think that's what's next. The more leaders have a long view, and long and broad, like I said, understanding the kind of impacts across the interdependencies in which an organization does its work in the world, and makes decisions accordingly. I think that's where we're going. So I would say it's conscious and ethical leadership, but before we can have that, we have to have the practices that allow for that. And those practices are personal. And they start with us at an individual, personal level. It's always interesting to say that because it sounds very self-indulgent at worst, which is, hey, leaders, go reflect, take some time to meditate, to reflect deeply, take some time for yourself. But ironically, that deepening into the self, as we understand it, into oneself, will have the impact downstream of helping our cultures and in organizations and our institutions themselves be able to operate in a much more beneficial, ethical, and conscious way, because leaders, like I said, have influence. And so, it's very important for leaders across the board, especially those who have influence and power, who are in senior positions in our institutions, in business, in government, and across all sectors. It's important for them to have access to ways to deepen conscious practices. It's important for them to have access to tools that will help them do things like reflection, meditation, and the building of awareness for themselves as individuals. Because I think, like all of us, they're busy people, but they're even busier because they have so many responsibilities layered on. So where do they take that? Where do they take that moment to deepen and to pause and to deepen, to develop this awareness of the environment and the way in which they're operating? And so I think what's next is real kind of a deepening at the personal level of what it means to be a leader. And it will be accomplished, I think, through contemplative practices.
So when you help develop the resources and the tools and the programs at Google, what did the adoption look like throughout the organization? Can you talk a bit about that? And is that representative of what you see in other organizations?
Yes. There was, I wouldn't say there was mass adoption. I did say it went viral, which means that there was huge enthusiasm for those that were enthusiastic about it. But there were more and more than we thought. And so we're talking thousands yearly. And so that's a relatively significant number. I wouldn't say it's like the entire organization by any means, and that's true for the other organizations we work with. It's a percentage of people who are interested in this, but that percentage is growing, and the enthusiasm is really strong amongst them. The program gets always really, really highly rated, and more importantly, qualitatively, you see people. It's like they're having like a drink of fresh water when they're thirsty. Like all of a sudden, there are practical and accessible ways to practice mindfulness and develop emotional intelligence, to develop these tools of awareness that are super practical and super accessible, and also based on brain science, right? So we know that if you do certain types of mindfulness practices, everything from meditation to journaling to certain types of active or mindful listening, you're actually activating different parts of the brain. That's why we chose those exercises, because it's kind of neuroscience based, secular neuroscience based. When we offer those experiences and those practices to people, the impact they have on people's experience, even right then and there in that moment, as they do those deepening practices, as they do those kind of conversational practices as well, is extraordinary. And people are often delighted and surprised that, taking a deep pause is extremely restful as well as insightful. They sort of like, wow, I kind of unplugged for a second there. And I had a lot of thoughts and reflections about purpose and meaning and values and things like this. So the enthusiasm which we originally saw when we offered this in Google continues around the world, across organizations and sectors. And I think, again, it's something I said earlier. It's not a set of practices that we commonly exercise in business. If you go to business school or you specialize in business or have that as your career, very rarely will you, at least when I was coming through school and in my business career, very rarely do you have a mandate to actually learn how to reflect deeply on things, to become aware of your own thoughts and emotions, to become aware of the thoughts and emotions of others, to become aware of the impact of your interactions. Oftentimes that's been relegated to self-help or personal development or soft skills, but it's actually a set of leadership competencies that are critical for the development of new ways of operating in this interdependent world, again, where we're focused on stakeholder value add. You need to have these skills to navigate that kind of environment. And like I said, it typically has not been a part of how we operate, but increasingly it's becoming so. And I'm very hopeful for that.
Yeah, one of the things I've observed is that there are leaders out there who see this as not just contemplative practice, but conscious leadership as a competitive advantage for their organization. And
Yes.
then there are others who are coming at it from a place of curiosity. And
Yes.
as we've seen those who view it and advocate it as a competitive advantage, and those who are coming at it from a place of curiosity, we're seeing some other, what I would call early adopters, saying, well, if they're doing it, then I should be doing it too.
Yeah, that's fine. I think it is a competitive advantage. I think first and foremost, it starts with your individual capacity as a leader to exercise mental clarity, emotional balance, effective decision making. It helps with all of that at the individual level. But then when you put that at the individual, when you bring that to an individual who's in an influential role as a leader within an organization, it does start to spell a competitive advantage. So it all kind of works together, like I said, I think. And if people see that organizations and leaders are having an advantage, like you said. I think that's not necessarily why you want to get into contemplative practice. I think a genuine curiosity and a genuine openness and interest in your own mental and emotional processes is the essence of this work. However, if what it takes to spark that interest is seeing perhaps somebody having a competitive advantage and you want to kind of get in on that, well, maybe that's its own curiosity, let's say. And so the important thing ultimately is, are you interested in doing the work, right? And so it really comes down to that.
Yeah, absolutely agreed.
If it's meaningful to you in whatever way, because you can't force it upon people, right? Like consciousness is something that's an emergent. Consciousness is an emergent property of individuals and organizations, and you can't force. It's very much like if you're a gardener, you can't force, a flower to bloom. It has to bloom when the conditions are right. And so the best we can do as practitioners in this space is to kind of prepare the ground and ensure that the causes and conditions of conscious leadership are there for people to engage in this exploration. And so, as I have in my whole career, I've always seen myself as a facilitator, and as a supporter for an unfolding process that's already happening. And the more leaders that can participate in that process, the better. But I'm here to kind of facilitate that. That's kind of how I see the work of those of us who are in this field of leadership, organizational development.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Is your team tuned out? Are you looking for a powerful speaker to motivate and inspire your organization? Then Tom Eddington is the choice for keynote speaker at your next conference or event. Tom is one of the most sought-after business advisors and coaches in Silicon Valley. For over 2 decades, Tom has advised world-renowned CEOs and executives on how to catapult their organization's success, including Hewlett-Packard, NBNA Corporation, and Royal Dutch Shell. In his dynamic keynotes, Tom offers fresh new paradigms on how to create healthier, happier, and more purposeful workplaces while navigating change and generating higher degrees of success for organizations. For information on booking Tom at your next event, contact eddingtonadvisory.com.
I love that metaphor of a gardener. It really resonates with me.
Yeah. All things in their time, but you can prepare the ground. You can help cultivate the causes and conditions for people to have that kind of experience. It's its own kind of leadership. And then I think when leaders do that for their organizations, when they champion these practices for their organizations, then they act as the gardeners for their culture and their people to really embrace these practices and to develop awareness and consciousness. Because the organization up and down is filled with leaders as well who need these tools. Anyone who lives today in the complex and changing times, the ever-increasing complex and changing times that we inhabit, can use these tools. So they're essential, Tom. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind. That's why I've devoted my kind of life and work to help cultivate conscious leadership, because there's no doubt in my mind at this point in time, at this point in history, given the challenges we face socially, environmentally, you name it, the only way we're going to be able to navigate that complexity is with consciousness and awareness and an understanding of kind of our moral and ethical foundations. And so ultimately these tools help build those qualities and that degree of character.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah. Exciting. It's exciting times, as long as we adopt and practice, because none of these go into effect unless we actually practice. And so even though we have science, unless we practice, it's kind of like brushing your teeth, right? We know the science behind that, but if you only tried it once and you only did it once, you wouldn't enjoy the effects, the beneficial effects. So similarly with awareness, these are kind of mental, emotional, moral, and ethical hygiene factors that we all are invited to practice. practice at a very deep level. Hopefully that will have beneficial effects for ourselves personally, for those in our spheres of influence, and then hopefully in the world in general.
Well, thanks for being on the show, Rich. It's been great spending time with you today. I would just ask, what's the one or two things you'd like the listeners to walk away with from our conversation?
That awareness is itself a quality that we can cultivate. It's a skill, and like any skill, you can grow it. And so find a way to develop awareness through reflection or contemplative practice, whatever that means for you. It could be connecting with nature, it could be developing a meditation or a prayer practice. It's up to you, but they call it practice for a reason. They call it contemplative practice, reflective practice for a reason, that it's something that's enacted, that you take deliberate time and attention to cultivate. So by all means, anyone who's listening, I would encourage, if you have the interest and inclination, to find a contemplative practice that works for you and create it as a rhythm and a routine, a regular rhythm and routine in your life and in your work.
And what's the best way for people to get a hold of you to learn more about what you're doing?
So you could always reach me at rich@SIYLI.org, which is SIYLI.org, or email info@SIYLI.org if you want information about the organization and its offerings, info@SIYLI.org, or find me in LinkedIn. And I'm always happy to support leaders and organizations who want to bring this work in for themselves personally, but also for their organizations.
Well, thank you again for being on the show. It's been terrific to have the conversation with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. Really appreciate it.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Thank you for joining Tom Eddington on the Impact Effect. Visit impacteffectnetwork.com to connect with Tom and discover additional episodes featuring today's top leaders making a global impact through conscious leadership in the world today.